So then Ratnakara asked this question, which is a very, very interesting question, very Mahayana question. How many of you, by the way, know nothing about Buddhism? Oh, good, very few. Well, you're going to learn something now. So, okay, most people know something about it. That's good. So you know about there's what I call individual vehicle Buddhism or Theravada Buddhism. In his day, there were many more than just Theravada, but these were basically types of Buddhism where the monasticism was heavily emphasized, which is very important, of course, by all forms of Buddhism, but more strongly emphasized by this group. And then they also had a vision of the world as irremediably bad, samsara, and they had a vision of the world, a vision of their, therefore, role and duty and aim was to achieve, in order to achieve happiness, was to get out of this world into a nirvana, which is out of this world, not in this world. So a dualist, you could call it dualistic Buddhism. And then there is what's called Mahayana Buddhism, or Universal Vehicle Buddhism, where they agree completely in a way with that same thing. It isn't that they disagree, except they say that when you get out of the samsara, you haven't actually gotten out of the world. Which is a little puzzling, it's puzzling sometimes to those who follow the dualistic form of Buddhism. Because they think, well, I mean, the world sucks so bad, how could you be blissful nirvana and still be here? Doesn't make sense to them. So it's more difficult, what's called non-dualistic Buddhism. But the non-dualistic Buddhism idea is that the world doesn't really suck that bad, actually. The world of ignorant persons sucks that bad, because the ignorant person thinks that they are separate from the world, and therefore they feel a kind of fundamental existential opposition between them and the world. And once you really feel you are separate from the world, and therefore in a way you're opposed to it, and it's opposed to you, more importantly, it overwhelms you. You can't overcome it. You can't conquer it. There's nothing. Therefore it's a bad scene. Because if you think you're against it, then it will beat you, and you've had it. Right? I mean, no one can think they can. Maybe occasionally an American president thinks they can conquer and dominate the whole world, or some emperors. Maybe the British emperor or empress thought so, but they don't. They learn. They learn very quickly that they can't, or they are taken to the funny farm, where they should have been from the beginning. But the non-dual one is a little more difficult, because the idea is that the way I see the world, as me being separate from it all, is illusory and incorrect. And actually, I and the world am totally intertwined. So I'm not opposed to it, and it is not opposed to me. And therefore, I can celebrate my interwovenness with the world. And then, although I notice that other people, many of them, seem to be feeling they are separate and they're freaking out. So then I naturally want to extend myself to help them realize that they are more connected and feel happier. So they can cheer up. And I have a very strong motive to do that, because I realize that even though I'm not suffering there, I'm stuck there. And if they keep freaking out, it's kind of a bother. Who would like to enjoy their nirvana with everybody else freaking out in plain view to them? Unnecessarily, because that their nirvana actually embraces all those others, and others have it themselves if they would only wake up to it. And so, it's a bother that they're all having its bads, about it. So anyway, the young Lichavi Ratnakara, after praising the Buddha, he says, let us read a little bit of the praise, it's so beautiful. He says, you associate with living beings by frequenting their migrations, yet your mind is liberated from all migrations. Just as the lotus born of mud is not tainted thereby, so the lotus of the Buddha preserves the realization of voidness. Voidness really means freedom, basically, that's all. So the mind of the Buddha is totally free, while still connected and aware of the mud of the beings who suffer in the world. You nullify all signs in all things everywhere. You are not subject to any wish for anything at all. The miraculous power of the Buddhas is inconceivable. I bow to you who stand nowhere like infinite space. So it's a very insightful praise that Ratnakara, this young yuppie, he's very, very, very deep actually, even though he's just a young boy from Vaishali. And but then he asks the Buddha a question. He says, then the young Lichavi Ratnakara, having celebrated the Buddha with those verses, further addressed him. Lord, these 500 young Lichavis are truly on their way to unexcelled perfect enlightenment. And they have asked, what is the Buddha's purification of the Buddha field? Please, Lord, explain to them the Bodhisattva's purification of the Buddha field. So you see, this is not asking what you might think the usual question you would ask the Buddha, which is, how do I attain enlightenment? He says, we're already, all of us, on our way to attain unexcelled perfect enlightenment. So we want to do that. And we already sort of embarked on that plan. And even when you say unexcelled perfect enlightenment, you mean Buddhahood, not just nirvana of an arhat, of a saint, not just escape from the world, you mean become actually a perfect Buddha. And so we want to do that, but then we know that becoming a Buddha means transforming, perfecting, purifying, and even making beautiful the Buddha land. And the Buddha land means the world as seen by a Buddha. So, for example, to me, this is the ordinary world, because I'm ignorant. But if Buddha was here, he would see this as a perfect sphere of Buddhas. Actually, nowadays, those days I said Buddha land, which is literal. Buddha Kshetra is the expression Buddha field. But nowadays I would call it, I like to translate it as Buddhaverse. Instead of universe, Buddhaverse. So how do you purify the Buddhaverse? How do you purify it means, how do you remove the suffering of others? How do you prevent the hells from existing? How do you get rid of the animal suffering? How do you get rid of the pretas, the sort of tantalized beings? They're not really ghosts. They're called hungry ghosts, but they're not ghosts. They're pretas, which is a kind of between a hell being and an animal, a really bad way of being, terrible. How do you get rid of the titan suffering? How do you get rid of the suffering of the gods? Believe it or not, the gods suffer terribly. They're miserable, the gods. That's why they get grumpy sometimes and flood the earth or make pillars of fire or do nasty things. They get very grumpy because they're suffering, which is hard to imagine because the heavens are very, very luxurious, but they suffer. So how to purify the Buddha field? So he wants to know, in other words, from the beginning, it's a non-dual question in that sense. It's like, we're on our way to enlightenment, to Buddhahood, but how are we going to change this world to be Buddhahood with us? He says, well, how do we perfect this Buddha field? How do we fix it up? Then the Buddha says, noble sons, a Buddha field of Bodhisattvas is a field of living beings. Why so? A Bodhisattva embraces a Buddha field to the same extent that he causes the development of living beings. But this is sort of Buddhist cosmology. Our universe is a field of the interlocked minds of all beings. It isn't like some real estate. Our interlocked minds, if we need real estate, we create real estate around our interlocked minds. And our minds are not just interlocked with other human beings. They're interlocked with animals, with beings in hells and pretas, and also with gods, including the creator god of the Indian culture, whose name is Brahma. But although Buddha, it turned out that there's this wonderful scene where Buddha meets Brahma and says, oh, you created, I'm trying to attain enlightenment, and you created the world, and so you know how the world is, and the nature, so please tell me. You should know what it is since you created it. And then after hemming and hawing for a while, and asking Buddha what were his credentials and many things, and did he have an appointment? Then Brahma actually finally admitted, well, you know what, I didn't really create it. I'm cracked up to have created it, but in fact I didn't. And I'm just the strongest guy around, and I have a good karma of having been born from previous aeon and universe. And so when I was there first, and other people showed up, and other gods showed up, and they saw me, and they thought I had created the place. And they said, oh, Papa, you created it. And I first said, I'm not Papa, I didn't create it. And they got so freaked out, then I said, okay, fine, I'm Papa. And then they felt comfortable, so that's how I've been letting them think. But the truth is, I didn't create it, we all created together. It's a product of our collective acts of all infinite evolutionary aeons of time, and we've made it together, and we're responsible for it together, and I'm powerful, I do my best, but other beings have to chip in.